First of all, welcome to everyone. I've been asked to introduce our speaker tonight because I know him from my the past. But before we do that, why don't we pray? The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Loving God, we thank you for all of the ways you are active in our world and involved in our lives. And we thank you especially for the beauty of creation and the beauty of your divine love that is seen everywhere we look. Please bless our time together as we reflect upon the visual arts and the art of icon writing as a glimpse into the heavenly realm that you call us all to. Please bless our time together. Be with us, speak to our hearts as well as our minds. And we ask all of this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Very happy to introduce you all to Father Peter Pearson. Peter is a native of Pennsylvania, and we found out today that he and my husband's family are from the same town, Williamsport, Pennsylvania, home of the Baseball Hall of Fame. Peter has been writing icons and painting for 55 years. Peter it was a Roman Catholic priest like me, and because of that, we actually know many people in common, and we became aware of that when Peter came to St. Andrews a few years ago when I was serving there as rector. So Peter would come almost every year to do an icon writing workshop at St. Andrews. Delighted that he's here at St. Mark's today. Peter is a former monk of St. Vincent Archabbey in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. Found his way then eventually to the Episcopal Church. He has served in a variety of different assignments. He is now connected to one of the Franciscan groups in the Episcopal Church. So he is a Franciscan. And also, he is co-pastor of St. Philip Episcopal Church in New Hope, Pennsylvania, where he was rector previously, part of a team ministry these days, where he is the co-pastor. And that's new, and he's very excited about it. But we're happy he was able to get away from there to be with us. So, Father Peter Pearson.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to spend the next few minutes racing through an outline which I gave you all. Folks at home, I will talk about the different parts of the outline as we go. I don't want to turn this into a 3-credit course. There's a lot of resources these days about icons that you can find almost everywhere. And it's a lot easier to find material now than it was when I started. I saw my very first icon when I was 12 years old. And it was not in church. It was hanging on the wall of my elementary school art teacher's home. She was a fine Episcopal woman. And the icon was painted by another fine Episcopal woman who was also a teacher in my school district. And I walked into the house and I looked over into the living room, and on the wall was this image that I'd never seen anything in my mind so beautiful in my whole life. And I asked a couple questions. There wasn't a lot of information, but I was at the library the very next day, pulling off the shelves, the Byzantine books that I could find. And I started just making it up because there wasn't a lot of access to teachers or to instruction books. And so I pieced together the things that I could find. Fortunately, right before that time, my mom had gone through her ceramics phase. So in the kitchen, up in the cupboard, was a box of ceramics paints. And my dad worked in the steel mill, and he brought home scrap wood. And I painted on scrap wood using acrylic paint. And I just made it up for years. For 15 years, I just did the best I could do with what I had, markers and ceramic paints and scraps of wood. At one point in my life, after 6 years of seminary, I took 10 years off because I wanted to grow up, but I moved to DC. And in DC, I met an Orthodox deacon who painted icons. And see, the problem back then was Orthodox people would not teach non-Orthodox people. It was just against the rules. So I asked this deacon if he would teach me, and he said, oh no, I couldn't do that. But I know a lady, and her name was Nina, and Nina was 95 years old, and she'd been painting icons for years. There's a Russian community in DC up by the National Cathedral. And so Nina met me, and immediately she said, if you want to learn that badly, I will teach you. And Nina was really interesting because her English was kind of broken. And so she didn't know the English words for a lot of the materials that we were using. And if you knew the Russians who came from the school of painting she came from, they made everything from scratch, except brushes. But they made their own boards, they made their own paints, they made their own gesso, which is like a plaster that you put down on the board. And sometimes Nina would just hold out a handful of something, and I'd have to guess what it was. And I usually guessed wrong. But Nina made her own paints using egg yolks and powdered pigments and a little bit of vodka. And the vodka was to preserve the egg yolks, but we painted that way for a number of years. And then I went from that part of DC, which is about 4 or 5 hours away from Pittsburgh, where I entered the monastery. And the first year in the monastery, you don't go anywhere. You can't do anything. So there was a lot of free time. I painted a lot. And while I was there in novitiate at the monastery, I found out that the only school of icon painting, Orthodox school in the United States, was 20 minutes down the road. So the minute I got out of novitiate, took vows, I was down there taking classes and eventually helping to do projects and helping to teach classes. And then I found out 20 minutes the other direction, there was this Greek guy named Nick who painted icons in his attic. And I called him and talked to him for a bit. And Nick said, oh yeah, come on over. Come on over on like Tuesday mornings and we'll paint together. And so I did that. And at one point, a couple years down the road, I decided that living in the monastery was no longer healthy for me. And so when I left, I thought, you know what? I've got nothing. I have nothing to lose. So I said, I'm going to paint. And if ever I don't have enough money, I'll get a job at McDonald's. That was my bottom line. I'll get a job at McDonald's. I never had to get a job at McDonald's. I always had, it was an amazing journey of faith, because when a bill would come in and I didn't have the money, I'd just say a prayer and say, God, I need more work. Not I need more money, I need more work. And it always showed up within like an hour. I don't know how that happened, but it was an incredible experience for me of just leaning into this and saying, yeah, this is what I need to do. And then about 30 years ago, somebody said, why don't you teach a class? And so I started teaching, and I have to admit, at the beginning, I was a terrible teacher because I was trying to make everybody happy. And that's not a good goal for a teacher. But I learned how to be a better teacher over the years. And so I've been teaching now for 30 years, and I've taught people all over the country. I've taught in Canada, in Ireland, and also in Italy. And it's just been amazing. And so I guess one of the big things is people talk about icon painting as if there's some kind of a rule book that you can buy and just follow the rules. There is no rule book. The teacher is the rule book, and you give the tradition to your students, and then they learn it, and then they turn around and they give it to their students. And so it's been sort of like an oral tradition or a lineage, kind of like you hear about in the Buddhist tradition, where teacher teaches, student learns, and then student becomes teacher. A bunch of my students are now icon painters and teachers around the country. And I'm just kind of coming to the end of 30 years of teaching, and I'm starting to pull back now. because I think it's time to make space for other people to step in and do what they do and have a chance to learn as well. So on top of my icon painting, I also have a doctorate in theology, and specifically in Byzantine theology and spirituality related to icons. And one of the advantages I have is being a person from the West, I understand what people are saying when they're writing from an Eastern perspective, but it doesn't always translate for Western people. So I learned how to translate by just being in that pool for a long time. So I want to talk a little bit about the history. If you want to paint icons, you need to know about a bunch of different things. You need to know about history, theology, prayer, and then technique. Most people think technique would be the first thing, but there's a whole lot to know. Like the fact that the original apostles were Jews, and Jews had a prohibition against images. But the second generation of believers were many of them pagans. And when they came to the faith, they brought their sensibilities with them. And they had grown up with images of their gods. And they had votive altars in their homes. And they started looking around at the Christians and were like, this is a little boring. Where are the images of your saints? Where are the images of Christ? Where are the images of the Blessed Virgin Mary and the angels? And so they started like leaning into that. And if you know in the Colossians, one of the things it says is Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Colossians was written in Greek, and in the Greek it said Jesus is the icon of the invisible God. And so that word just means image, but they started playing with how are we going to make images of Jesus? Because, you know, if you think about it, for the Jewish people, God doesn't have a face because God doesn't have a body. But for the Christian people, God has a face. And so we paint the image of Christ. And then as a result of all of us being images or icons of Christ because of our baptism, we can also make images of the saints. And so just knowing about that history, the first icons were actually painted in Egypt. And if you've ever seen these things called the Fayum portraits from Egypt, after the time of King Tut, when somebody was coming to the end of their life, they'd have a portrait of themselves painted in an idealized style. And it was on a thin piece of wood. And when they died, they would wrap that into their mummy. And it was painted in a Roman style of painting, a technique using melted wax with color mixed into it. And those things were eventually, the early Christians were like, hey, we could do pictures of Jesus. And we could do pictures of the saints. And very few of those original paintings still exist because there was a time a little bit down the road where there was a major controversy about images, and many of them were destroyed. There are still 13 of the original old ones that still exist, and they're in the Sinai Desert at St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai. And a couple years ago, I was blessed because at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, they had a show of some of those images, and they brought them over, and I got to get like really close to see how they had done that. And there's no way you're ever going to see those unless you go to the Sinai Desert, which is not a good place to be these days, but they exist there. So eventually what happened was they took those images and they brought them to Constantinople, to the Byzantine Empire. And people took that art and they kind of mushed it together with Byzantine art. And Byzantine art, of course, is a descendant of Greek art. And so suddenly all those figures of Jesus, Mary, and the angels and the saints took on this Olympic look. So they became monumental, and they became a lot beefier than they were in the old days in Egypt. And everything, the early Christians in Byzantium they had been doing mosaics for floors for centuries. And the early Christians said, you know what, we could do that on the wall too. And they moved the mosaics up on the walls. And all of the little tiles, especially the golden ones, they would put in at different angles. And there are certain feast days in the monasteries in Greece where they will swing the chandeliers. And so all of these gold tiles twinkle. And it looks like the saints are dancing, like that church down in San Francisco, the Dancing Saints at St. Gregory of Nyssa. But they did it all with light. And so for centuries, they had that. And that was when the controversy started, the iconoclastic controversies, which means icon breakers. And it was, honestly, it's like so many things in the church, it was mostly political. And then somebody created a theological rationale for it, you know? But it was really about who's going to be in charge. And it was right at the time when the Muslim empires were rising and there were pressure from the Jews, and some of the Christians were like, you know, we really shouldn't have images either. And they went back and forth, and it was extremely violent. They destroyed a lot. They also maimed a bunch of people who made images. And at the very end, the bishops just stepped in and said, you know, we really need to talk about this and figure this out. And one of the saints of the early, of that period, John of Damascus, created this argument that said basically what I said a few moments ago. We know that the Jews don't have a face for God. We know that the Muslims don't have a face for Allah. But we have a face for God, and it's Jesus' face. And so we have permission because of our tradition, because we believe in the incarnation, that God is here with us, and God can be experienced in the face of a person. And so they call that the triumph of orthodoxy. And they still celebrate that every year in Orthodox churches. They'll have everybody bring their icons in on that Sunday. And they have a procession around the church, and everybody carries their icons in procession. So a couple centuries later, the people up in Kiev, they were looking, the Vladimir, the prince, was looking for a religion to unify his people. So he sent folks out in all different directions. And they went to Constantinople. When they came back, they said, when we stepped into those churches, we didn't know if we were in heaven or on earth. And so they were baptized. The people of what we call the Ukraine were baptized. And they brought the icons from Constantinople, and they started to like this. Every culture does this. You take what's brought to you and you mush it together with your art. And so iconography changed, and then they brought it to all the different parts of Northern Europe and what we call Russia today. That didn't exist at that time. But Moscow and Novgorod and St. Petersburg, they all developed their own styles. And if you notice, when you look at Russian icons, they're different than Greek icons. Russian icons tend to be a lot skinnier, slender faces. They all look like they're fasting. And they're very simple. They also will often have very simple color schemes. If you think about it, down in the Mediterranean area, you were in the middle of all kinds of trade routes, which meant you had access to all kinds of different pigments, which are basically the minerals and the clay and even the jewels like lapis lazuli that they would grind up to make paints. But if you're out in the middle of nowhere in Russia and it's always snowing, and it's just miserable all the time, the only access you have most of the time is to whatever you can find down in the river to grind up and make your icons. And some people think that's less interesting, but I actually think it's more interesting because when you have limited supplies available to you, you have to get really creative. So today I paint with 5 colors. And I know a guy who paints with 4 colors. That's one of my goals, to get to 4. But he uses less and less colors, but does it in the most amazing ways. So that's what happened. And then the icons of Russia were considered to be like the highest ideal in about the 13th century. And there was a man named Andrei Rublev who painted the famous Holy Trinity, which is the three angels sitting around the table. Almost everybody's seen that icon. That's the icon that they judge every other icon by, because they think that he's a saint in their church. They think nobody could have possibly touched that much beauty without being holy. And so that became the norm. And then a couple centuries later, Peter the Great loved everything Italian. And of course, you know, the church in the East and the West got divorced in 1054. And so in the West, things started evolving in their own direction, whereas iconography kind of stayed the same, even though there were variations. And so Peter the Great, loving Italian stuff, had painters come up to Russia to teach the icon painters how to paint right. And so icons started looking like Italian oil paintings, except that they had Slavonic inscriptions on them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But then a couple generations later, a couple hundred years later, sorry, they came to the New World. The Russians, everybody sent missionaries to this country, and we did what Americans do. We took the whole tradition, all the different parts, and we smashed it together, and we created what I call the contemporary style. And a lot of things happen in the middle. I mean, there's a lot more history that I'm covering, but iconography, some people will tell you icons never change. That is absolutely not true. They change and they stay the same. So if you see an icon of St. Nicholas from the 5th century, and you see an icon of St. Nicholas today, it's the same. You can tell it's the same person. I don't know how many of you saw that movie called The Agony and the Ecstasy with Charlton Heston about Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel. Well, there's this one scene where Michelangelo's in this pub having dinner one night, and he's looking around at the different people in the pub and he's sketching them on a piece of paper. And then at the end, he puts a circle around their heads, and that became whoever. They would never do that in the East, because how a saint looks is not up to you and your imagination. The whole thing about icon painting is to be faithfully transmitting the tradition. Obviously, your unique insights and everything are going to come through, but St. Nicholas always looks like St. Nicholas, and Jesus always looks like Jesus. And people wear certain colors, people hold certain things, people bless in certain ways. And if you like red hair, you don't get to give the Blessed Virgin Mary red hair. That's just not part of the tradition, because it's important that we try to be as invisible as possible while we transmit the tradition. It would be like one of those monks in the monasteries who's copying the Gospels. Even if you were the brightest monk in the room, you didn't get to fix the story. You know, your job wasn't to fix the story. Your job is simply to transmit the tradition. So that's a really fast thing of the history. And one of the cool things that happened since I've been painting icons is in the late 80s, early 90s, the Soviet Union fell apart. And toward the end of that, a lot of people started painting icons because that was an act of political defiance. And so in the Eastern Bloc countries, they started establishing icon schools. And then the whole thing fell apart. And it's really been neat to watch, because at the very beginning, because they had lost that art for a long time, they were just faithfully copying the icons. And as time has gone on, and they know the tradition more deeply, they have actually started playing with the tradition. And it's really fun to watch. They're playing with colors, they're playing with the sketches, and Nicholas always still looks like Nicholas, but sometimes he'll have a red halo instead of a gold one, or something like that. New things are happening. It's really cool. Along the way, probably in the 4th or 5th century, in the churches in the East and the churches in the West look very similar to each other. And the priests needed an area to be able to do the liturgy. And so what they did was they started putting up a low barrier, kind of what's become the communion rail in our church. Not this one, but in some churches. And that was really to just wall off an area for the liturgy to happen. And then after the triumph of orthodoxy, somebody got this idea, why don't we put up some pictures there? And slowly the icon screen started to evolve from the bottom up. And if you go to some of the churches up in Russia that are made of wood, they could go even higher than they could go in Greece because they use stone. And so you go into a Russian church and the screen goes all the way to the ceiling. And there's a wonderful, if you ever get to DC, right around the corner from National Cathedral is St. Nicholas Russian Orthodox Cathedral. It is the most astounding space. For years, it was just a real simple concrete church. In the 90s, they brought icon painters from Russia, and they covered every inch of wall space. And when you walk in there, you understand why those people said, we didn't know if we were in heaven or on earth. So I recommend, if you go to National Cathedral, go around the corner, check that place out. So just jumping down to theology a little bit, in the Eastern Church, they're really committed to this idea that we are all icons of Christ, who is an icon of God. And so there is this wonderful sense, unlike what happened in the West, where we became obsessed with our sinfulness. In the East, they became very focused on the fact that sin is actually more like sickness. And this is the way one of the theologians talks about it. Imagine that we are all silver teapots and that God is the big silver teapot. And unfortunately, because of our lives and because of the wounds that we've incurred and the traumas that we've experienced and the sin that we've chosen, that teapot has become tarnished. And you can't really see the silver anymore. And in the Eastern Church, they say our job is to work with God to get the tarnish removed so that the silver shines again. And the icons are there to remind us who we are. So that when you go into a church, and I think we forget this a lot, it's not just us doing the liturgy. It's us stepping into the liturgy that happens around God all the time. And I couldn't remember which book of the New Testament or which series of letters, but it says we are surrounded by a cloud of unseen witnesses. And we step into that cloud when we come to worship. Well, it's easier to see that cloud when you step into an Orthodox church and they're everywhere. You know, sometimes we just forget and we think it's just us. But it's to encourage you and to make you realize that you are not alone here. And so like in an Eastern church, when you have confession, you go up in front of the icon of Christ and the priest just stands off on the side and you're having confession with Christ. And see, they have a different sense of image than we have. In very ancient times, like even in the Egyptian times, a person's image carried part of their spirit, which is why they would make people burn incense in front of statues of Caesar, because you weren't just worshiping a statue, you were worshiping Caesar's energy that was coming through his likeness. And so in the Eastern Church, it's not just a picture of somebody that you're remembering. It's actually an encounter with somebody. And it's a very vital and vibrant encounter. And so they've developed different ways of trying to be present to God, to Christ, to Mary, to the angels, to the saints. And one of them is called hesychism. And if you know anything about the Jesus prayer, which is nothing more than, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. It didn't start out that way. It started out Jesus. And people would just say the name over and over again. And in saying the name, it's kind of like centering prayer. You have something that you can focus on that helps you to let go of all the other stuff. And also, in the Eastern Church, you have the image to look at. It's not like there's some secret prayers you say in front of an icon. You just stand there and experience looking at the icon and experience the icon looking at you. And there's something in that glance, you know? So that's important, hesychism. That's the whole spirituality around the Jesus prayer. And then I did say something about the heaven and earth. Jumping down to prayer, I believe, and most of my teachers believe, that you can do a technically perfect icon, but if you don't have the soul part of it, the spirituality part of it, it's a nice painting. And there's something about being actively engaged in a life of prayer and a community of prayer in order to be able to paint icons well. So there's a spiritual practice here. And I know for myself, I honestly, my house is, well, except for that one room where I paint, I don't have a lot of icons around the house. For me, the prayer is the painting, the process. And some of my folks who are online or here know that, like, if you do this the right way, there's a point where the brushstroke becomes the litany. It becomes Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And you just dissolve. And it's wonderful because it's not about me anymore. And the brushstroke becomes the meditation. I can't explain that to you, except that all of us probably have something that we love to do so much that when we're painting or washing dishes or baking or whatever, you can be engaged in it. And 4 hours later, you look up and you're like, I thought it was 10 minutes. That's the thing that you're being invited into in the process. And I grew up in a very complicated home. And so icon painting had become sort of the way that I just stepped away and had quiet time. And it makes me laugh sometimes because I've turned my coping mechanism into a life. And I'm so glad that I had that. So I'm jumping down to techniques. If you listen to some people talk about the techniques, they will try to convince you that there's only one way to do this. Originally, icons were tapestries, jeweled book covers, panel paintings, and even statues, because icon means image. Over the centuries, it's become narrowed down to panel paintings. And so that has become I think a fallacy that some people are putting out, that there's only one way to do this and there's only one set of materials to use. And I've been on panel discussions in DC with some Orthodox theologians, and we all agreed it's not about the paint, it's not about the brushes, it's not about the panels, it's about the prayer and the invitation for you as the painter to step into that silence. And then if you do it in a beautiful way, it invites other people to step into the silence too. They may not be painters, but they step into the silence. So originally there were encaustic paints, which are melted wax with pigment added. Then somebody said, you know what? I made fried eggs the other day and the yolk leaked onto the plate and I didn't do the dishes right away. And if you've ever done that, you know how hard it is to get the egg yolk off the plate. They were like, what if we mix color with that and see if that'll make nice paint? Because it's oil, really. The center of an egg yolk is oil. So egg tempera was born. And then, I don't know, 700 or 800 years later, somebody said, what if we put linseed oil? But because of that little thing with Peter the Great and the Italian painters, they've never gotten over their resentment of the Italians. So if you paint icons, never admit that you use oil paints. If you're going to do it, just don't tell me. All right? Because they're still mad. And then I personally use acrylic paints because when I was 15 years old, my dad gave me my first set of acrylic paints. And I've used that since. And many of my teachers, both Orthodox and non-Orthodox, use acrylic paints. And I just find that in teaching, especially, It's just such a kinder way to teach people because you don't have to make everything from scratch. So really quickly, I want to just show you a couple of icons in different stages. So ever since COVID, I've been teaching online classes. And I don't know if you can see this at home. This board has a drawing on it, and it's Saint Jerome with the lion. And then I put the drawing on the board, and then I put yellow all over it. That's how you start. And we use wood. These days, we use plywood because it doesn't warp. In the old days, they would use solid wood panels, which eventually warped and destroyed a lot of paintings. But the old, like that board I just showed you, probably cost me about 20 bucks. This is one of the really good boards. And it's got a raised panel on the edges, and then they carve into it. And it's got things in the back called splines, and that's to counteract the warping. It's really complicated to make a solid wood panel. This one has a hole in it because the people at the shrine in Arizona that commissioned this, they have a relic that will fit right in here, one of those little relic things. So that's going to go in there. These are the parents of Saint Therese of Lisieux, and they're saints now. Zoe and I forget his name. I will know his name in a couple days, or I'll think of it in the middle of the night. I'll call you up. But Therese's full name as a nun was Saint Teresa of the Holy Child, Holy Face, and the Holy Child. So I put an image of the Holy Face up here. And that's one of the oldest known icons in the church. And it has a completely different story than we use. But this used to be called the Veronica, which means the true image. And then somewhere along the line, somebody said, you know, that's a really nice name for that lady who wiped the face of Jesus. So the Veronica became Veronica's veil. So there's a lot of history to learn about these things. Another one that I want to show you is from the image that we're going to be doing here at St. Mark's. And if you really like this, you can always still jump into the class. This is an image of Christ, the face of Christ. And what I did was I put the drawing on the board. I use patterns. You don't have to freehand. That's one of the ways you teach. You give people patterns until they start to know what these folks look like. And then after I got the line drawing on, I just started adding some brown to make some shadows and to give some depth to it. That's the way we're going to start this icon starting tomorrow night. And then after you do that, you start applying color. I don't have anything. I have a couple of icons here that Heidi did with me. This is Hildegard of Bingen. And when we paint the icon, when we put in the colors, we put in all the big areas of like the dark, what looks like black from where you are. We put it's all black or gray or green. And then on top of those big areas, we start adding layers of lighter colors. So it's not like blending like you would do with different kinds of art. Everything is layered. You're basically sculpting with lights. Even on the face, the whole face was brown. And then in the certain areas on the face, like the cheek, you add a lighter color just in certain spots. And you do it in thin layers so that it looks like it's blended. And then at the very end, we put the lines back in after we get through the whole thing. It takes a while to learn this. So there are many images. Just at St. Andrews last weekend, we did, this is called a Coptic style icon. It's in the Egyptian style. And you notice this looks a little bit more cartoony than some of the other images that you've been seeing, because the Egyptian style tends to be a little bit simpler. And in the background, it's got all this lettering. That's why I did that one, because everybody hates doing lettering. And so I found one with the most lettering I could find, because I figured the only way to get over the fear is to do it. So this is an icon of the Good Shepherd. And in the background, it says, Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends. But from a distance, it just looks like a little design in the background. So looking at an icon requires that you actually go in there. You spend time. We live in a culture where we glance at things and move on, and sometimes we don't get it right. I see that in the grocery store all the time. I'll be going down the aisle for toothpaste and I'll grab what I think was toothpaste and I get home and it's tooth gel. And I'm so annoyed with the store because they put it in the wrong place. And it was just me not spending any time being present to what it said on the label. So imagine that with pictures of the angels and the saints. So anyway, there's a bunch of icons up here. And there's a lot to learn. I tried a couple years ago, I took my class notes and I turned it into a book called A Brush with God. And then that was sort of an introductory book. And then I made another book called Another Brush with God. Really catchy title. But this is like the next level. I'm actually working on another, I think I have one more book because this was 20 years ago. Everything has gotten simpler in the 20 years. And I think that's one of the things, I love this part of my life because I'm starting to realize a lot of things really aren't necessary. I've gotten it down to 5 colors, 3 brushes, and a lot less fussing. And that's one of the hardest things when you come to paint an icon that I have found with many of my students is you bring who you are to this process. So if you're a perfectionist, you're going to be a perfectionist. And if you're a person who worries, you're going to be a worrier. And, just the list goes on and on. I used to be a person that constantly fixed things until one day I realized that my fixes were causing more problems. And the amazing thing is, icon painting has taught me life lessons. Like, I don't futz. That's what I call it. I don't futz with things anymore. I just do my best and then I leave it. And there's a great deal of freedom. That this is a spiritual journey. And it's funny to think that a paintbrush can teach you how to live. And it can also teach you about God. And you can live in a relationship like that icon of Hildegard. The first time I was invited to do an icon of Hildegard, I didn't know anything about her and I got to know her. And there's something very intimate about painting someone's face. I want to end with this. There's an iconographer named Bill McNichols who says, if we spend our whole lives looking into the eyes of the saints and the angels, how can we not become like them along the way? And so I'm looking at a lifetime of doing this, and I hope that I have become more like some of the people I've been looking at and learning about and getting to know along the way. So I would like to just open it up. I don't even know how long I just talked. I talked a long time. But I want to open it up for questions. If anybody has any questions or comments, and even the folks at home, feel free to jump in.
On your hand, oops, is it on? Yeah. On the handout, one of the things you have is theology of silence. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, in the Eastern Church, not so much in the Western Church, but in the Eastern Church, they have a theology of silence. And what they say is if you're talking about God, everything that you have to say about God will eventually lead you to silence, and it will lead you to paradox. How can God be human? How can life come from dying? Those kinds of things. And that there's just this place where you just got to stop talking and you just have to be with God. In the West, we call that contemplative prayer. We're very left brain in the West. In the East, they're very right brain. And the problem is we've been divorced for so long that we've been existing on half of our pistons or whatever, that in order to be more holistic, we have to step into the silence to be more whole. And I think when we're whole, we're also holy. So we don't have a lot of silence these days. I remember having a course when I was a college student where the professor said, why don't you guys go out and listen to the birds sing for about 5 minutes every day? And I thought he was out of his mind. I was 18 years old. You know, I'm not sitting around listening to birds when I'm 18, but now I do. And I get it finally. And maybe that's the grace of just getting older. Yes.
So do you have a favorite saint to spend time with or a favorite saint to paint? Or what
My
else?
favorite icon is the one we talked about a few moments ago, Veronica's veil. There's something about just painting the face of Christ. I've done it hundreds of times. And I don't know why, but I keep going back to that one. And what I would normally do is I do a lot of commission work and I'm teaching a lot of classes, but usually during Holy Week, I suspend all of my work and I do something as an exercise for Holy Week. And I usually end up painting the Holy Face. And if you go to like St. Nicholas Cathedral, over the door as you're going in is that image so that you know who you're going to see. You know, it's a phenomenal image and it's got an amazing history. There's a book called Holy Places, Hidden Faces, and it tracks the history of that image all through medieval Europe and the Crusades and going back even perhaps to the lifetime of Christ. And they have a completely different story for it, but it is fascinating. And I mean, just when you think about it, God has a face. You know, we don't even enter into how deep and rich the incarnation is. And that's very big in Franciscan theology, but it's also very big in Anglican theology. We're focused in a big way on the incarnation. And one of the things that the Franciscan theologians said that salvation history and Jesus coming to the world was not plan B, that we messed up plan A, and so God had to send in the recruits, that God would have come whether there was sin or not, because God did not want to be separate from us. And I think that's absolutely beautiful.
I have just a couple questions from cyberspace here. I have two questions. Number one, is there a difference between icons and wall ceiling paintings in churches? That's the first one. Would you like the second one now, or do you?
No, let me
Okay.
do that one first. Icons can be walls and ceiling paintings if they're done in the traditional Byzantine style. And that involves a whole lot of schooling. You need to know about sacred geometry. You need to know about the history like I talked about. And sometimes you have to paint on the walls. And these days, more often than not, what we do is we paint on canvas and we glue it up on the walls because it's so expensive to rent scaffolding. But they'll use almost canvas-like wallpaper. But every once in a while, you'll find somebody who still goes in and puts up the scaffolding and paints on the wall, just like Michelangelo did. And that is an amazing thing to see because in Orthodox churches, usually there's a big dome over where the people are. And up in that dome, there's an image of Christ looking down over the people. And in order to paint that on the walls, you have to put up this, what's called a wedding cake scaffold. And I was in a church in Michigan years ago. I had a class there, took the people over because I knew that somebody was painting this church. And we walk in, we see this scaffolding, and I heard somebody calling my name. And I looked up, and it was one of my teachers, Valentin. And he was from Toronto. He's a Russian guy from Toronto. And Valentin's like, get up here. And so I went up, and he's painting the eyes of Christ, and the eyes were like 3 feet wide. So you can imagine how big that dome was. Most amazing thing. But that's really expensive because they spend months in the church painting the icons, but they're icons too.
Peter, we'll come back to the cyberspace question, but one from our table. The images of the dancing saints at St. Gregory of Nyssa,
Right.
isn't it?
Yeah.
In San Francisco. Do you consider that an icon?
They are icons. They're done in a style like, I don't know how much that gentleman knew about icons when he started painting, but he's pretty faithful to the tradition. You don't normally see people moving in icons. You notice that they're usually very still. And if you go to St. Gregory's, those are all action shots because they're all dancing around the dome. And Christ is right in the middle, holding a cross and dancing with them. So it's the tradition, but they're also tweaking the tradition.
Very good. All right, second question. Can you explain a little more about what is the difference between icons and idolatry? In parentheses, I grew up in an iconoclast background, so the concept of iconography is still very new to me.
Yeah. A lot of that conversation, it's interesting. I taught it at some different seminaries throughout the years. And what I've learned is that a lot of the folks from Reformation traditions, they don't study a lot of church history from before the Reformation. So they didn't know that we'd already been through this argument before in the 7th and 8th century. Idolatry is when you worship that thing, thinking that God is in there, in that thing. And honestly, we don't worship the thing. For us in our culture, we have a lot of other idols we need to be worried about, and paintings are not one of them. We worship a lot of things, and we think that that will save us, like our money and our resume and our prestige and our power and our guns and all kinds of things. So we're not in a big danger about that. But one of the things that I came to a couple years ago was in the West, it's funny, but nobody seems to talk about the fact that words are images. They're just a different kind of image. So if you look at the word fire, that's not fire. That's a symbol representing fire. So what's the difference between that symbol and a picture of a fire? I'm still not done chewing on that one, but it seems to me that if I were to think that either one of those two things was actually fire, that's idolatry. It's when I realize that it just points. In the Zen tradition, they have this saying, fingers pointing at the moon. And the problem is, if you get focused on the finger, you don't see the moon. And our job in worship is to see the moon, not the fingers. So as an iconographer, my job is to be as invisible as possible, which is why I don't even sign the icons except on the back. You know, if it's not taking you to the real God, the true and the holy, like El Shaddai, if you're not getting there, you've got some stuff with an idol going on. Is that? Okay. Okay, so the ones upstairs, the question was, tell us about the ones in the church upstairs. They're hanging in the corner back by where the Compline choir stands. Those are all icons from classes that I've taught. And what I normally have to do when I'm teaching a class is I have to find an image that's simple enough to be able to get through in a couple of days. But there are, I don't know, there's probably 15 to 20 icons up there. They're all kind of small. Some are from my in-person classes and some are from my online classes that I started teaching at COVID. And they're the simplest images, but I always try to find something that will give a person a new skill set to explore. So like I showed you at the very beginning, the one with the lion. We don't paint a lot of lions. And so most of my students have never done that. Or like during Advent, we did one that had some texture in it. And I invited my students to find ways to create texture in icons. So the ones upstairs, actually the Advent one is part of that. There's a Holy Family up there. And instead of actually creating texture, I painted texture with color. And I created the illusion of texture. Sometimes there are two kinds of faces in icons. There's faces with beards and faces without beards. And if you can do those two faces, you've got it. You just have to variations on a theme. There's two kinds of hair. There's gray hair and there's brown, black hair. If you can paint those two, you got it. And then there's hands, and hands are not my favorite things because you can do a hand badly and it looks like a claw. And we've all painted claws. And so you paint badly until you get better, but those things are all in those images. There's a variety of saints up there. There's Saint Lucy. There is Saint Hildegard is up there. The Holy Family, like I said, there's a big one of Christ the teacher with a book, and the book is open. That's Christ the teacher. If the book was closed, that's Christ the judge or Pantocrator. That's the ruler of all. I think there's an icon of the mother and child up there. That's from a Russian. When I'm teaching, I frequently will pick icons done by other masters and say, let's see what we can figure out about what they do by copying what they've done. And so we go through that a lot. And I'm always on the search for something beautiful and interesting that will push the students a little bit beyond their comfort zone and sometimes a lot beyond their comfort zone.
Speaking of that, what do you think of the Russian icons that are upstairs in the nave?
Oh, the ones up on the either side by the Eucharistic, they're beautiful. And they have a lot of gold leaf on them. And I don't frequently use gold leaf when I'm working with students because it is such a difficult and persnickety material to use. If you've ever seen gold leaf, it looks really solid and deep. Gold leaf is actually about the depth of a butterfly wing. So if you touch it with your hand, it just disintegrates. And so you apply that on top of a red base because gold leaf is also semi-transparent. And you have to put a glue down that stays sticky. And then you have to hope that there's not too much humidity or too little humidity. And then you lay it down like you would aluminum foil and you rub it and it sticks to the glue. And then you have to polish it. And so those both have beautiful gold leaf work on them. They're painted in the Russian style and they're echoing what I consider like the 13th century, which was considered to be the highest point. And they're both quite lovely. And if you haven't seen them, go up to the front behind the altar and on either side as you step into the chapel behind the glass, they're right there and they're in glass cases. Really, really lovely. And if you go and do that, spend some time just being there. That's the big thing. Don't just glance and move on. Spend some real time there. The one of Mary is Mary with her hands up like this. That usually appears in the dome of over the altar in an Orthodox church. And that's Mary with the incarnation. Baby Jesus is within her body. They call that she who is more spacious than the heavens. Because in that sense, Mary was the only human to be able to sort of enclose God and not die. And so she appears over the altar because she was the first one to bring Jesus into the world. And that's exactly what happens below. The priest brings Jesus back into the world one more time and one more time and one more time, or at least makes us more aware, both through the word and through the sacrament. And so that's what you're echoing. They have all kinds of wonderful connections, but that's Mary at prayer with Christ within her.
Is it true that in Byzantine iconography that the Virgin Mary always has the Christ child, always appears with Christ?
It's, you know, what's funny about icons is there are rules like that. And then you find 50 examples when they didn't follow the rule. And that's the funny thing in the East. Everything isn't black and white. It's, they make a rule and then they ignore the rule. So oftentimes, more often than not, Jesus is always in the image, but sometimes not. He could be in the next panel over, like the images of the crucifixion. Sometimes you'll see an icon of Mary, an icon of John, and an icon of the crucifix, but they're connected. She's always connected.
Anyway, one reason that I came back here was because of the icon of Mary and Jesus behind the altar table there. So anyway, I've sort of fallen in love with that, and I feel comfortable talking to Mary, and it's very peaceful to me. Another thing, my mother's dear friend, Sonia Zuboff, was the daughter of the last Russian governor of Alaska. And when I was little, I always used to watch her. So I learned how to make the sign of the cross the right way.
Backwards, what we would call backwards.
Yeah, and she was very, very special. And I know she had a deep faith, and I used to watch her.
Yeah.
And I don't know why that is so in the Eastern Orthodox Church, but that's the, according to Sonia, that was the right way.
3 times, 2, 3. Oh, got to do it 3.
Everything is done multiple times in the Eastern Church. And the interesting thing is, for Westerners to go to an Eastern liturgy, it's very unsettling because we're used to going in and sitting in our pew and staying there until it's time to go up for communion or whatever. In the Eastern Church, you've got people going up and kissing the icons. The priest and the servers are coming in and out of different doors. The choir is singing, the priest is singing. People are like going in the back in the vestibule because it's a long service. And in many Orthodox churches, there's no pews, you stand. So you have to develop what they call Orthodox legs, or you collapse. There's chairs on the side for weak people. But the liturgy, in their sense, isn't a classroom, it's a dance. The dancing saints at St. Gregory's. And our job when we step into the liturgy is to be swept into the dance of God. And like, that's such a different concept from what we all grew up with. You know, you went in, you sat down, and somebody preached at you, and you got communion, and then you went home. You know, it's just a completely different experience. It was a feast of the senses, because you got the incense and the oil and the water and the bread, and you get more bread after communion, the leftovers, and all kinds of wonderful things happen, and you're moving around.
Peter, we have another couple of questions from our Zoom attendees. First is, you mentioned that there are traditions that are followed in icon painting, and that making, quote, corrections to the text, end quote, is not done. Are there icons being painted of subjects that haven't been done before?
Yes, absolutely. Because there are always more saints, and they weren't around in the 3rd century for the prototypes to be made. And so usually what I recommend to people is, if you're a beginner, don't start making your own icons. Let somebody who's got more experience, who knows how to do this, who knows what they're doing. For instance, about 5 or 6 years ago, Bishop Dion from St. Louis called me and said, we're putting Barbara Harris on the calendar, but we don't have any icons of Barbara Harris. Would you make us one? And so after I said, why don't you ask an African-American person to make that icon? And he said, we'd love to, but we can't find any who paint icons. So he asked me. And so what I had to do was I had to go to my friend Michael, who's a bishop or a deacon in Boston, who used to work with Barbara Harris. And I said, tell me about her. Tell me about her so I can get to know her. And then Bishop Dion and I talked about the different things that they wanted to include in the icon that would have some significance. And Bishop Dion also has a pretty good sense of humor. And he said, you know, and Michael confirmed this. He said, you know, Barbara liked to smoke cigarettes and she liked to go to the casino. And like, can you figure out a way to put some of that stuff in the icon? So if you ever see the icon that I did of Barbara Harris, it has the coat of arms of the Boston Diocese. There's a frame around it on the inside that's a chain, and the chain is broken in certain places because she was very much involved in social justice issues and breaking the chains. And then there's an incense thurible down in the one corner because she was there when they ordained the first women. And somebody told me that she had been the crucifer, and then somebody said, no, she was the thurifer. So I put a thurifer and the smoke rises up, but in the thurible, I hid a cigarette. And I always point that out to people. So because she would laugh and she would invite us to laugh, you know, because we always think saints don't have any of the habits that we have. And a lot of saints do. Some of the best saints I know swear like truckers. You know, as long as they're like us, it's more easy for us to believe that maybe we can be like them. So I included that stuff. And that happens all the time. There are different people who come forward and you have to create new icons. And a lot of people are doing that because we have tons of new saints.
Thank you, Peter. Another question is, might you explain the different perspectives between worshiping an icon as opposed to using the icon as a pathway to God? Thank you.
You know, one of the problems is language. Sometimes we say worshiping the icons. We don't really mean worshiping the icons. What we really mean is worshiping with the icons. And it's a linguistic problem, and that's left brain. And the problem is we're so Western that we have a hard time leaping over the chasm between the two cultures. I hope that we're moving into a place where we get it more and we're embracing more and more the spirituality of the East. I don't know if they're embracing more of the West, but I hope that's happening so that we can find a middle place. I do not believe that when I was a kid, I grew up in a Polish neighborhood, but there were a lot of Baptists that went to my school. And a girl that I knew ever since I was little, she said, "Oh, you're Catholic. You worship statues." And that almost led to a fist fight in third grade. And the problem is she'd heard that from other people. And she never bothered to be curious about what that meant. And she became a Baptist minister and I became something else. And I'm pretty sure that we probably both mellowed out a little bit over the time. But like, we don't worship statues, and I don't really understand, even having grown up in that, like I don't use those things a lot. It's the process of making them. Now, what other people do, I don't know. But I know that there are icons all over the world called wonder-working icons. And those icons have changed somebody's life somehow. People have been healed, they've been converted, they've been reconciled, all kinds of good things have happened. So that's a designation of a certain kind of icon. And when something is designated a wonder-working icon, they usually put a gold crown on the figure. You've probably seen some icons of Mary and Jesus, but there are saints too with the gold crown. And I don't know how God works in those situations, but I do know that God works. And there's a church, an Orthodox church, a poor little Orthodox church where I live, and their icon in the church, there's a stand in the front, in the middle. Oil started coming out of it, perfumed oil. And it smells like flowers. And people go there, all kinds of people from different traditions go there for Vespers every Wednesday night, and they anoint people with those oils. And somehow people's lives are changed. And one of my friends, I've never actually gone because I get a little creeped out by some of that stuff sometimes. But one of my friends brought me a little baggie with a cotton ball with some of the oil in, and I didn't ever open it because I don't know what that's about. But I put it in my studio and I went back to my room and went to sleep and came in the next morning. My studio smelled like flowers. And I don't know what that's about, but I didn't open it because I don't want tours coming through my living room. You know, so I don't know how God works, but I think God works in the ways that we as individuals need God to work. And sometimes that's through an image, and sometimes that's through a word, and sometimes that's through a chance encounter with something. But I do know that God works.
One other question from the Zoom world. Are icons of saints painted differently than icons of Jesus?
No, actually, they're not. They're not at all. Obviously they're different faces, different beards, different looks, but the process is exactly the same. Layer upon layer of color on top of darker colors. And so you're constantly, well, this is what I say with icons. You're always bringing order out of chaos and light out of darkness. And those are very biblical ways of doing things. That's the whole story of creation. And so the process is always the same. Yeah.
I was wondering, could you talk as an iconographer about the phenomenon of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which seems so connected yet so completely disconnected?
The image of the Guadalupe, in the Eastern Church, they actually call that the Mother of God not made by human hands. And they call the image of the Veronica's veil Christ not made by human hands, because both are believed to come from supernatural origins. You know, the cloak of Juan Diego, he walked in to talk to the bishop and he dropped his cloak and roses fell out in December when there shouldn't have been roses. And then they looked and the image, supposedly according to the legend, the image of the Mother of God was there on the poncho, basically. And there are a lot of details in that have been super analyzed over the years. And like people say that if you look in her eye, you can see the reflection of Juan Diego kneeling on the ground in front of her. The stars on her cloak are the constellations that would have been in the sky at that time. The colors and the garments are of a royal person from that native tribe, from that area. And she showed up to a people who were being oppressed. And instead of speaking to them in the language of the oppressor, she spoke to them in their own language. And my spiritual director says that if you're really in the midst of spirituality, it always leads to freedom. And that image is an image of freedom, even in spite of oppression, which is also the message of the gospel. So, and then I have this other friend who's completely skeptical. I've been to Guadalupe and down in the little area behind the altar, there's a moving sidewalk. So you don't crowd around the image. And I went on that moving sidewalk about 5 times to see if I could actually see everything I needed to see. If you get a chance, it's an amazing experience in Mexico. I'm not a big Marian person, but it was amazing to watch the faith of the people who somehow they could relate to the Virgin of Guadalupe. And if you know anything about the Southwest, her image is everywhere. It's on tattoos, it's on cars, it's on buildings, shirts, and then in their homes, and they have processions with the image and everything. That's something very important for those people came through that image. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for allowing me to come and talk. I can talk. I sure can talk. And thanks everybody at home. Some of our students are here and I really appreciate that. And if you look, Donna has all her icons behind her up there. So, thanks.
Okay, is that better? If you'd like more of Peter Pearson, you can join the icon writing workshop that will happen here tomorrow through Saturday. Also, he'll be preaching at all three of our morning services here at St. Mark's. Just a special reminder that next Wednesday night, we have the Reverend Danae Ashley, who's going to speak to us about Hildegard of Bingen and psychotherapy. So please come to that. Anything else? I think that's it. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.